Good morning. My name is Neil Minks with VML. It's my distinct privilege to introduce our first speaker of the day, Joe Flores. People often describe the state budgeting process as being very similar to sausage making. And I think Joe offers a unique perspective in that he's participated in budget development both from the executive department side and from the General Assembly. So he knows his sausages on both ends. Joe is currently the Deputy Secretary of Finance. In the prior administration, he was the Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Resources. And before that, he was on the Senate Finance Committee staff handling health and human resources issues. I'm sure he had a life even before then, but it was pretty much uninteresting. So with that, I'll ask my friend Joe Flores to step forward.
So good morning. What Neil didn't say was that I actually had sausage making experience in Minnesota for 6 sessions, along with Jesse Ventura, so you can imagine the sausage there. And then in Texas more than 20 years ago, 25 years ago now, hard to believe. So I do appreciate the invitation to speak with you, and I see some familiar faces, so it's nice to see you guys. So I know it's a friendly audience, or at least I hope it is. But first of all, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for the leadership that you show at the local level. And we're going to need that leadership. We need that leadership more and more every day, as you can see by the dysfunction in D.C. And we're not always the best partner at the state level, and you don't need to shake your heads, yes. We're not always the best partner, but I think we do what we can do. And we understand that you guys make us look good at the local level, whether it's the schools that are operated, or the community services boards, or local DSS. And as you mentioned, Health and Human Resources is where I spent more than 2 decades working. And if it weren't for what you guys do, what your staff do at the local level, because people show up at the CSBs or the local DSS sometimes in a really bad shape. And we don't always provide the level of funding that we need to, but you guys stitch together funding and make it happen and keep us out of the newspaper. So I truly thank you for that, because if it weren't for you guys out there, we'd be in a world of hurt. So I also want to say that we hear your concerns. We've heard your concerns, whether it's in the K-12 area. So you see an additional increase for state employees, for teachers, also state employees. And there's uncertainty about the impact on CSBs of Medicaid expansion and general plan reduction. So we're trying to address that. We ask you to be patient with us. We're going to aggressively monitor that, and if we need to make changes, we're willing to do that. And then finally, it's a small piece, but on the communication sales use tax, you guys let us know that that was a concern of yours. Not necessarily the amount right now, but maybe down the road. It set a precedent that you guys were nervous about, and so we addressed that. Again, it's a small issue. And then broadband and local stormwater assistance. So we heard and we tried to address a number of your concerns in this year's budget. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of background information about, this is going to sound odd, but what we were thinking as we put together the budget this fall. Talk about that process, talk about the governor's priorities, looking back at 18 and looking forward to 19 with a bit of trepidation. Talk about the revenue picture, because obviously we can't allocate resources to any particular item without knowing what the resources are. And then give you a little inkling of where we may be headed for the next go-around in terms of the budget process. Jim suggested that you guys might be interested in what we're thinking about next go-around. So, do you have a clicker by chance? All right, I'm not always good at forwarding the slides, so if I get behind, please yell at me. Neil always does. In terms of orientation to this session, which begins tomorrow, I think it's important to look back. And it's important to remember that last session, you had a new governor, Governor Northam, my boss, and you had a new House, essentially, and an equally divided House in both the House and the Senate. So 1 vote margins in each. In spite of that, the fact that we had equally divided chambers, you had a pretty successful session in our estimation. We expanded coverage after many years of trying to low-income individuals who need health insurance. We added significant resources to K-12, but also to our behavioral health system. And this is an issue on Step Virginia and Community Services Board where it's a bit amusing that, for years we would complain about the lack of services that you guys provided at the local level, but we only required you to provide emergency services. And so we finally said, you know what, if we want to change the game, and we've been talking about this for too many years, we need to ratchet up the responsibility on us and you, and then fund it. And I think you're finally seeing that, and you saw those investments last session, and you see them this session as well, in this governor's proposal. We added funding for state employees, as I mentioned, but also to support locals and teachers, and then boosted our general fund revenue reserves, which had fallen very, very low. So low that the rating agencies were, put us on watch, and were looking over our shoulders. So we had to do some work with them, quite a bit of work, during the session, just to explain to them what we were doing and why we were doing it, and where we were headed. Now, the end of the session, as you can imagine, for those of you who've been watching, was quite unusual. And the way it played out with expansion and the ultimate budget left stuck in the craw some legislators, shall we say. And that tension has continued to simmer over the session, over the interim. So much so that we knew that we needed to do something, or would have liked to do something on tax conformity this interim, but there was no way that we felt like we could get any sort of agreement in the House and the Senate on tax conformity. It's an issue I'll come back to in a minute. Their tax policy, as the first speaker mentioned, is going to be an issue that we wrestle with this year. You've seen some reports about it already, and then the implications on the budget. So the more tax cuts you provide, the less money that you have available, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. There will be additional resources on the table to the tune of $2.1 billion, and there are a number of one-time resources related to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It's about a little bit less than $1 billion, $1.2 billion that will flow to the Commonwealth, but a little less than $1 billion is one time, and so the governor allocated those one-time resources for one-time needs. And then this is a short session. It's amazing that we cram all of this work into a 46-day session. That counts weekends when staff are working as well. And we will be doing that. And then also, obviously, it's an election year, so who knows what will happen. In terms of the fall budget development process, we basically began developing the budget just months after ink was dry on the current budget. So agencies were in the process of implementing legislation that was enacted in early June, actually late June, so almost July 1. And then in September, DPV sends out guidance to the agencies about what their expectations were. We initially approached this as a typical off-year budget. In off-year budgets, we look at the governor's priorities. Can we fund any of the governor's priorities with the resources available? We look at any emergencies that may have popped up, any life safety issues that we need to address, and then also any unavoidable cost increases that we hadn't expected. And so we were mindful of that as we were going through the fall development process. We knew that revenue growth continued strong, and we were very confident that we were going to have additional resources from the Federal Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as I alluded to earlier. So from my perspective, this was my first time participating in the budget process on the executive branch level. For 20 years, I did it on the legislative side, and we were always in a reactive mode. We waited to see what the governor was going to put forward. And there's a maxim in state capitals that the governor proposes and the legislature disposes. I hope it's not so much true this year, but that's typical. The governor is the first act of a multi-act play, and we're going to start the next act here in tomorrow. But also, typically, the General Assembly of the legislatures really tinker at the margins. A lot of what we propose, maybe 80 to 90% of it gets done, and it's not very glitzy. It's the things that we have to do. It's at the margins, left and right, where we hear a lot of chatter and spend a lot of time, frankly. But for me, the executive budget process was different because it's a soup to nuts exercise as opposed to what we did in the General Assembly, where again you're reacting to what the governor puts forward. We Went through the same exercise though. How much money do we have available? What resources are there? And then what things do we need to fund? What do we have to do? What do we have to do right now? What are the governor's priorities and can we fit those in? And then what are some of the nice to do items? Things that maybe we can do if we have resources, but maybe we have to wait until next year if resources aren't available. And then this year, with the additional revenue that I mentioned that's coming in from the Federal Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we needed to consider tax relief. And to the extent that we provide tax relief, it takes away from investments that we want to make in K-12, or public safety, or health and human services. So some people are saying, let's give it all back. If we fully funded our behavioral health services, or K through 12 education, or public safety, that might be a good idea. I think, and I don't know if you guys agree, but we probably have some things that we need to do in the Commonwealth, including shoring up our finances. And that's where the governor came down. So you're going to see a plan that invests in core priorities of the Commonwealth, sets aside a little money for tax relief, but also deposits quite a bit into a reserve fund to prepare for a rainy day. So that leads into my next slide, which is the goals of the governor's priorities. Again, were to build up the savings account, prepare for a rainy day, fund the things that we have to do, like the Medicaid forecast. And unfortunately, in November, that forecast came in a lot higher than we anticipated, about $463 million. Now, I should clarify, that is only to fund the current services that the current Medicaid program provides for the current population. It's not the expansion population. It's the current Medicaid population. So you're talking about primarily children, pregnant women, the elderly, and disabled. We needed $463 million just to continue those services going forward. The governor also proposed strategic investments to build up the Virginia's economy, whether it's economic development, broadband, rural economic development or workforce, and then also to strengthen our educational system. And then also, to the extent that resources became available, we were looking at things like expanding health care, providing an additional increase for teachers and state employees on a one-time basis, school safety, public safety, election security, and then infrastructure in transportation, water, and clean energy. So those were some of the goals of the governor's budget that he included in his budget. So in terms of the revenue picture, I'm not going to get into this in detail, but basically 2018 was a good year. We had projected or forecasted revenue growth of about 3.4%. We didn't quite double that, but we came close to doubling it. So revenues were pretty strong. It added $552 million to the bottom line. So it was a good year. I'm not going to touch on the next slide. It's more detailed for you if you want it. That shows some of the changes by the major categories of spending. And then if you look at the national indicators, in October and November, things were looking pretty good and continue to look pretty good, but there's some conflicting messages going on out there in the economy, and you see that reflected in the changes in the stock market. Employment was fairly sort of on level, 237 in October, dipped a little bit in November, so we were thinking, oh geez, and then on Friday came out at 312. So it's kind of going up and down, and there's not real clear guidance about what's happening there. Consumer confidence took a hit in November, in October, and then also, in November and December, and it fell off a little bit more in December. So you're seeing some anxiety from folks out there, and if you've opened up your IRA statement, you may not want to for a while because it's not going to look good. So that's adding to people's anxiety about what's going forward. And then the index that is used for manufacturing also took a sharp drop, if you look at that bottom bullet point, in December. So there's some conflicting things going on, and we're still not sure. So we were optimistic in November and remain optimistic, but there's some storm clouds on the horizon, which is why, again, we thought we needed to set aside money in reserve. I'm not going to get into the next slide, other than the last slide, which is, again, there's uncertainty that appears to be creeping onto the national scene and the state scene, whether it's related to trade policy, the divided government now in D.C., and then the federal government shutdown. Who thought it would last as long as it has already, and it doesn't appear to be any end in sight, unfortunately. I think I missed that slide. In terms of FY19, things have started out pretty good and are continuing to look strong. You see that bend in November. It's really a timing issue related to how many deposits were made. And amazingly, to me, it does have a pretty large impact on the swing. So we We adjusted for that and smoothed it out, and you can see that the revenue growth is still remaining positive. So we're feeling pretty good about that. In the fall, there's a consensus forecasting process that we use. The governors have always used to prepare the budget. We listen to what's called the Joint Advisory Board of Economists, and then the Governor's Advisory Council on Revenue Estimates. First the economists, and then the business people. And almost to a person, they were very bullish about where we were headed. And then again, this is before the latest December data, but payroll withholding seems strong, the economy seems strong, and everybody seemed to endorse what's called the standard forecast, which was higher than the budget revenues that we budgeted for last session. So again, feeling pretty positive about where we're headed. And nobody at this point has projected a recession this biennium. Even though, as you know, and if you were watching, this is the longest expansionary period, if it hasn't already become, may become in the next few months. So again, all good things must come to an end. Hopefully there'll be a soft landing, but we'll see. So in December, again, we revised the forecast upward by about $400 million and an additional $140 million based on payroll withholding. So again, reflecting the fact that things look strong. When the money committees, the House Appropriations and Senate Finance committees had their respective meetings in November, they were also pretty bullish on the revenue growth. And so they actually projected more revenues than we ultimately did in this budget. So it's nice that everybody's in the same ballpark in terms of this. So in terms of the Federal Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I'm not going to get into much detail here, but I would ask you to draw your attention to what's circled and then the one-time and ongoing revenues here. In this biennium, again, there's revenues related to the Federal Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Most of it is one-time. About $950 million is one-time. So obviously we can't use that for ongoing expenditures, or if you could, but with the rating agencies looking over our shoulders, it wouldn't be a wise thing to do. It's about $950 in one-time revenues, primarily related to individual tax provisions. And then there's another about $150 million that will be ongoing, and we've incorporated into this budget. And I'll talk about some of those, how we use those resources here in a minute. In terms of the internet sales tax, the Wayfair decision came down in June, another sort of complication in terms of our budget development. Initially, when people were talking about the revenues that would flow from Wayfair or internet sales, there were estimates ranging from $250 to $350 million. At the same time, when we were looking at these revenues, we noticed that our sales tax numbers were way above forecast. And I think it's because businesses were voluntarily remitting those sales tax. And so my point is, we've got $155 million a year that may come in, but it's a little bit squishy at this point because we're still trying to tease out how many businesses have started remitting their sales tax receipts and how many have not. So this will be an issue, I think, that comes up during the session. You can see it's only $55 million, or about a third of that goes into the general fund. Others go to locals for education, and then other earmarks. So the next slide I'm not going to get into. It's just more detail about some of the adjustments that we had. And the next slide, the bottom line is that, as I said, we've got about $2.2 billion in additional revenue for this budget that the governor has proposed spending and tax cuts. And then the General Assembly will get a chance to rejigger that when they start meeting tomorrow. In terms of the spending side, there's about $2.4 billion in new general fund spending in this budget, offset by about $300 million in savings. And for those of you that have been following this for a number of years, it's extraordinary to have this amount of money on the table in a supplemental year. And so in a 46-day session, again, it's going to make things very interesting. And of course, it's an election year, so it's even more interesting. So a combined net increase of $2.1 billion. Let me get into more of the details here on the next slide. So if you add up just these two categories, and I'm sure you can't read that, but I'll tell you, about two-thirds, a little bit less than two-thirds of the additional funding that the governor suggested to be spent is on maintaining our cash reserves and fiscal integrity. Over $1 billion is being set aside in our sort of rainy day funds. And then the Medicaid forecast and other things that we have to do adds another $500 million. So those two items alone, the $1 billion plus for the rainy day reserves, and then just maintaining the cost of current services gets you over $1.5 billion of the 2.4 that I was mentioning. The next slide is just a graphic of that. You see most of the additional funding went to improving cash reserves and fiscal integrity, the blue portion of the slide. Orange is just maintaining current services for population. So these are obviously the orange slice of the pie are things we have to do. And then you see investments in K-12 education, water, economic development, transportation, behavioral health services, etc. So I mentioned earlier that we've gotten really low on our revenue reserve funds. I think it was about $258 million just a few years ago. And that was for a state that has the AAA bond rating. That's not good. And so there was a commitment last session to start to bolster that, and then in this budget as well, you see that. So we're projecting that we're going to get to $1.5 billion at the end of this biennium, and that would be a historic amount that we've set aside. And the reason, of course, that we're setting aside is that, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that we've had this expansion for a number of years, and who knows what's going to happen. The other unknown is the federal government. You know, they just cut taxes to the tune of $1 trillion, adding $1 trillion to the debt deficit. What does it mean if we go into recession and you have populations like happened 10 years ago with the Great Recession, where the federal government opened up the spigot to help states out and to help you guys out? And it's not real clear if they're going to have the resources or the will to do that. And so we want to be really cautious here. The top 10 spending amendments, again, you probably can't read that if you're in the back, and I apologize for that. So I guess the point is, I mentioned the $1.5 billion that we've set aside, $1 billion for additional funds for the revenue reserve funds, and then $500 million plus for the things that we have to do. There's also another $168 million for K through 12 education. Catch up with my notes here. For K-12 education, including the additional 2% for teachers, but also the one-time deposit to the literary fund to free up resources to address some of the school construction needs that we've heard are out there, and we acknowledge that. There's $75 million for the Transportation Infrastructure Bank to be sort of last resort funding for transportation deals that you guys might be working on. So again, an acknowledgement that that's a need out there. There's $74 million for the required deposit to the Water Quality Improvement Fund, and then another almost $100 million for stormwater local assistance, and then broadband, an issue which we know is very important to rural communities. And then those latter two are initiatives that ultimately we're going to invest, if the General Assembly goes along with it, and that's a big unknown, $250 million over 5 years for stormwater local assistance, and then also broadband. So it's a commitment that the governor felt was important to make. Obviously, we can't commit General Assemblies, or the governor is not going to commit himself in future biennia, but that's his plan at this point, and I think that's what he intends to do. Whether or not the General Assembly goes along, we will see. Other items included are a one-time bonus for state employees and state-supported locals effective December 1st. It's about $40 million. There's $36 million for school counselors for K through 12 education. An additional deposit to the Water Quality Improvement Fund of about $35 million. $28 million for VITA, which is the gift that keeps on taking. $27 million for Piedmont Geriatric and Catawba Hospitals, a long-running dispute with the federal government. And then $20 million for economic development, large business sites to make sure that they're ready to go when you're ready to go. And then also $19 million for the Virginia Housing Trust Fund. In the interest of time, I'm not going to cover the next slide, which provides a little bit more detail on some of the more granular proposals. And then we've talked about some of the one-time uses of the one-time revenues that are coming into the Commonwealth. There's 5 areas where the governor is proposing that these one-time revenues be used. One is the Earned Income Tax Credit, making that refundable for low-income people. That helps people with income below $50,000. The reason for that is that they are the population that benefits the least from the federal tax cuts. It's funny how there's a lot of focus on right now on the state tax increases, and I'm sure you're hearing this, I'm not minimizing it, folks are getting a $4 billion reduction in their federal taxes, $4 billion. And then they're getting a little bit of increase on the state side. And that's again what we're trying to balance out, using some of those additional revenues for some of the investments we need to make, with the understanding that we do need to provide some tax relief too. And that's what I think the governor's budget does. And then, I'm sorry, I mentioned the commitment on the water quality, stormwater local assistance fund for local projects, agricultural best management practices, additional funding there, broadband, and then the revenue reserve. So those are commitments that the governor intends to make, whether or not the General Assembly goes along next go around. I think Jim is going to touch on this a little bit, but 5 of the budget drivers make up about 73% of our general fund spending. So that's K-12, Medicaid, corrections, behavioral health, and then higher education. That doesn't change very much in this introduced budget. So in terms of the future, what does the future hold for us? The new Secretary of Finance, who was the former Secretary of Transportation, it was our opportunity this year, he and I, and Jim Jennings has been around for a little while, but it was our chance to actually develop the budget this fall. And just observing that process, I think we have some different ideas about how we can go about that next session, including, or this fall, this interim, including looking at the base budgets a little bit more closely than we have in the past, and that's a lot of work. We've got about a $40 billion plus biennial general fund budget. And if we don't take the time to scrutinize that, as I mentioned earlier, we sort of tinker at the margins with the budget. We need to look into the base. And if we can, it's not going to be easy, if we look at the base funding and figure out where there's some flexibility, even if it's just 1%, you're freeing up $400 million that you can allocate to your priorities. That's something that the Secretary intends to do, and we'll be rolling that out hopefully sometime this interim. It is going to be a multi-year effort, and I'm sure we're going to hear some squawking and screaming, but we want to make sure that state spending is consistent with agencies' missions. And we're probably going to look at non-general funds too, federal dollars. A lot of agencies tend to look at federal dollars as their money. It's not their money, it's your money, but it's also the General Assembly's obligation to review that and to spend dollars as wisely as we see. And I wasn't expecting applause for that. And then just to wrap it up, as I mentioned, the governor's proposed amendments are the first act of a multiple act play. Hopefully not a long play, hopefully a short play. And the governor, in my experience, and I worked with him when he was elected to the Senate, has certainly demonstrated a willingness to listen, to ask others to come in and express their opinions or concerns about what we ought to do. Sometimes we can accommodate them, sometimes we can't, but he's certainly willing to listen. And again, that's something that you're not seeing right now of 95 right now. Tax policy is gonna dominate the sort of beginning part of the session, and again, that has implications for how much revenues are available for strategic investments. And then obviously, I just had to do it. It's an election year, so put your seatbelts on because it's going to be an interesting one. So that's all I've got. I'd be happy to take any questions. Softballs are preferred.
Are there any questions? Well, just a comment.
Yes, sir.
There is a language in the government proposed budget, coming out on the last session, and I'm sorry not to bother with this, it's low in your radar, I guess. But regarding pay raises for constitutional officers, there's language in there that would be problematic for the locals in terms of some of the locals, many of the locals supplement their salaries. And those employees are all on our pay plans. The language as written would be hard to give it.
Okay.
Joe, can you repeat the question for all of us to hear?
Has to do with supplemental increases for constitutional officers, I believe. Some problematic language. So I'll work with staff to make sure that we understand the
I
information.
need to email them because they go aware of it this morning. I'm certainly with
Okay. Sounds good.
I want to make everybody aware of it also.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Yes, Bill.
Joe, what's the actual impact on the list of projects providing $80 million for
the list?
So the last time we had come up with a list, I believe there was about $82 million in projects. So it's almost equivalent. The question is, I think that list may be a little bit old, so some projects may have moved along. So hopefully we found a sweet spot, but that's something we'll have to monitor. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
So I know that we lost some transportation funding in the last budget, and maybe you already addressed this, and I didn't hear it, but was the transportation funding that was taken out of our roads to fund Metro, has that been returned or in this budget?
I am not a transportation expert, but I think the answer is no. I don't know. So Neil says I'm correct, so that doesn't happen very often, but apparently that is true, yeah. And I think that was a decision the General Assembly made? I don't know. I don't want to point my fingers, but if it's that much better than us. Okay. Yes, sir.
So, totally from a budget standpoint of wanting to be conservative and looking forward in terms of having capacity with a rainy day fund, as it's called, for future downturn. Just one thing that I ask in the future for considerations, just not to be overlooked, are some of these smaller programs that are growing in cost that the localities are absorbing. One of them, the line duty. So, it's a program with the localities picking up and absorbing the costs associated with that. I don't know if that's included, covered within that increase of the $5.8 million for public safety, but if not, we, just appreciate future consideration for that. And then others, this might just be an issue more related to the DB than others, but the disabled veterans tax exemption program, they get 100% if they qualify for the program, and we are military and we have a high level of veterans, so that cost is growing considerably for us. So it's in the tune of about $5 million a year right now we're absorbing, and it's growing at a clip of about 20% a year. So it's getting on up there.
And I'm not familiar with the tax, or the tax credit, if you will. So is it a local?
It's a property tax exemption.
Yes, so if they become disabled, the veteran qualifies for 100% exemption of their real estate tax, which just for us is our #1 local revenue source. So it's,
That's helpful and certainly bears watching. Yes, sir.
Regarding the new investments in Department of Environmental Quality for stormwater local assistance, can you talk a little bit more about how you envision that looking system to require a match for our local governments? That's something that we want to do.
Yeah, I was looking at that this morning. I know that there will be contributions, I think, from the federal government envisioned as well. I don't know. I'll have to ask that question to see what expectations are. Typically well, I don't want to go there. I'll find out for you. If you want to leave me your card after you're done, I'll certainly follow up. All right, well, I certainly thank you very much and wish you well this session. I have to tell you, too, that I told Suzette that I was going to be here, and she was very encouraging. And you guys are lucky to have her in the governor's office because she definitely hears your concerns and make sure, to the extent that we can address them, that they're addressed. So, thank you very much.